You're listening to Rebel Justice, the podcast from The View magazine. When we think about justice, we think about it as an abstract, something that happens to someone else, somewhere else. But the justice and the law regulate every aspect of our interactions with each other, with organisations, with the government. We never think about it until it impacts our lives or those of someone else. Our guests are women with lived experiences of the justice system, whether as victims or women who have committed crimes, people at the forefront of civic action who put their lives on the line to demand a better world. We ask them to share their insight into how we might repair a broken and harmful system, with humanity and dignity. We also speak with people who are in the heart of the justice system, creating important change: judges, barristers, human rights campaigners, mental health advocates, artists and healers. I'm Louisa, and I'm a new member of the team at Rebel Justice. Today, we've got someone who has been tireless in her fight for human rights. She is accomplished in being an unwavering support for those particularly disadvantaged by the system, working with immigrants, transgender and cisgender women, and the LGBTQIA+ community. Her cases often revolve around lived experiences that the government would rather overlook than scrutinise, but she has continued to reinforce their voice in the face of adversity. Would you like to introduce yourself, Jane?
Yeah, thanks very much, and thanks very much for having me on. I'm really delighted to be here and looking forward to our conversation. My name's Jane Ryan. I'm a partner at Bat Murphy Solicitors, and I specialise, as you've said, largely working with women and LGBT people who have had contact with the criminal justice system.
So what made you go into areas of law around the protection of women's rights in prison in the first place?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question. Well, I suppose like many people, it wasn't really a sort of single, light bulb moment. I probably had quite a naive belief that I wanted to change and challenge injustice. And as I developed in my career, that became more and more focused on a kind of commitment to accountability, and particularly state accountability. I have, some family experience of people within criminal justice and mental health, significant mental health issues within my family. And I think that gave me a particular empathy for my clients and for the experiences that they had. When I started out my career, and this was in the sort of heyday before the drastic and savage cuts implemented by LASPO in 2012. And at that time, prison law was better funded and you could have a more variety of cases. So I had a sort of caseload of, a different scope of prison law from what you see now. So categorizations, parole board reviews, security, etc. And I would, happily travel around the country, meeting my clients and getting that insight and developing that sort of frontline practice and understanding of what it was like and the experiences that they had. But what I realized or came to experience was that I had so many male clients, just so many, and so few women. And so when I did get a woman's case, I was always, very keen to do it because, they're so underrepresented within my cohort of clients. And ultimately that has just led me to kind of focus on women's rights within prison particularly. But that's obviously not to say that, I think there are real problems that men experience within prison as well. And, particularly in terms of mental health services, incredibly high levels of violence. We saw an urgent notification in December just gone for H&P Swale side about, the appalling circumstances within that prison. So I think a lot of the issues that we'll talk about touch upon men's experiences as well, but I have sort of inevitably chosen to focus on women.
You were talking a bit about mental health, and obviously you've represented various vulnerable individuals that live with mental health conditions. Do you feel that the general public do not fully understand the impact of mental health and tend to avoid discussions about it, often like putting it into its own box of them being labeled as weird or odd?
Yeah, I think that's an important. Well, I think there's probably still, a quite significant stigma around
Yeah,
particular mental health issues. I mean, there's obviously catastrophic failures in regard to mental health services in the community, and we're seeing that being exposed through the Lampard inquiry, which is ongoing into the inpatient deaths in Essex. And there's a separate mental health inquiry that's been set up in relation to Teesside. So there's obviously like very, very significant problems in terms of the care that people are provided in the community. And I think, yeah, probably tied to that, there is a stigma in regard to mental health and offending behaviour. Perhaps, I don't know what your experience, Louisa, is, but obviously you're a mental health practitioner, so you'll know better than me. But, you see it with particular diagnosis, such as emotionally unstable personality disorder. So
yeah,
despite a kind of groundbreaking report over 25 years ago about how that diagnosis shouldn't be a diagnosis of exclusion, you still see that sort of, oh, this is a behavioural choice, etc., coming up again and again. And I think also importantly tied to that is how we approach substance misuse, because it is consistently not treated as the disease that it is. And
yeah.
I think that has really significant consequences and is really important for how we think about criminal justice in this country.
So, how, with women's rights overall in prison, how do you think they could be best improved?
That's a very, very important question. So I think, well, if I think of it as a sort of starting point in terms of what I do, so my driver is accountability and trying to seek accountability. And so
Mm,
for a client, that can come in many different forms. That could be, for example, having a face-to-face. It could be through a settlement meeting. It could be through instigating disciplinary proceedings or referral to a regulator, or through the legal process seeking to sort of require changes within that. And, that would be something that can achieve some changes.
mm,
But what we repeatedly see, and I think what is important in terms of your question, because you can have a lot of policies and potentially a lot of litigation, but if there isn't that grounding in operational practice, then it doesn't really mean anything. And
yeah,
we see that because we see the kind of repeat failures. So I think the starting point would probably be, for me, in terms of an improvement to women's rights, is, and this is a difficult one, but listening to women in prison and
mm,
listening to women in the criminal justice system. Um, and I can give some examples if that would be helpful in terms of what I've seen in my cases.
yes,
Um, I acted for Louise Powell, who was a woman who was sent to prison in 2019, and she was sentenced to 30 weeks. And she arrived at H&P Style when she was unknowingly to her pregnant, because horrifically she was pregnant through an assault. And over the course of her short imprisonment, her pregnancy, there were multiple missed opportunities to identify the pregnancy. And in particular, other prisoners identified that they thought she was pregnant. And Louise, when she went into labour, was desperately calling out and crying for help. And there's sort of really, I mean, I don't want to traumatize people listening, but there was really appalling CCTV of her walking down these steps, bent over, doubled over with pain from labour, and asking for help when she was in labour and not getting that help. And so
Mm.
she wasn't seen by a nurse. And appallingly, she ended up giving birth in a prison toilet, unaided. And very tragically, her baby did not survive. Now, that terrible, terrible circumstance really highlights a lot of the issues of what is wrong with women's rights within prison. So those prisoners were not listened to. Louise wasn't listened to. And had they been, there would have been an opportunity to help her and save her baby. And I think also what's, really significant about that case is that the healthcare provider conceded that, but for the negligence, so but for the failures in listening to Louise and the failures to identify her, to identify the pregnancy, that the baby would have had medical attention and would have survived. And so that is really the most profound and devastating, life-changing event for any individual to have suffered. It's absolutely appalling. And what we discovered, and through Louise's incredible work that she undertook in going public with what happened to her and
Mm.
participating in a long Article 2 investigation into the circumstances of everything that happened. And what we found out is that because the healthcare system and the prison system was in effect designed for male prisoners, so that there wasn't that process to identify the pregnancy. And so specifically, there was what's called a secondary health screening assessment. And
Mm.
there's no, because that's for men, right? So there's nothing on that on that form at that time or the subsequent forms associated with that investigation that could identify her menstrual history, a history of sexual health, or contraceptive history. And so that to me really, really highlights like what can go wrong when you have a system that isn't centering women,
Yeah.
because had that been in place, then Louise would not have suffered what she suffered, and her baby would have survived. And so, it's, I mean, that is a really stark and shocking example, but I think it highlights what we see and what myself and campaigners and other lawyers and women in prison experience.
Yeah. I mean that story is just horrific that someone would go through that, and the fact that she had the strength and the courage to be able to go public with that so that she could make lives better for other women in prison that could face that sort of challenge. Would you say that case stays with you when you try to advocate for others?
Yeah, I mean, definitely. I mean, it's a really, it's a really stark and horrible example of what goes wrong. I mean, you know, plainly, there was also the tragic death of baby Aisha Cleary at Bronzefield.
Mm.
And so those two appalling appalling baby deaths in a very short period of time, I think were real kind of, were an absolute crisis point in terms of what was happening to pregnant women in prison.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, obviously on an emotional level, participating and working with Louise certainly stays with me, definitely.
Do you think that the issues faced by, I mean, you said it yourself about how the prison is structured to operate with male prisoners. So
Mm.
do you think that the issues faced by pregnant women in prison are local to certain prisons, or do you think they're just a continued systemic issue?
So I think there's been changes. So partly because of those two absolutely horrific deaths that we've talked about. And
Mm.
so following that, there was a new framework and operational guidance issued, which did make improvements. For example, requiring a midwife be allocated to each individual women's prison, and so that is obviously a very important safeguard. And so there have been some changes. I don't think those changes have gone far enough. We have seen sort of separately to sort of outside what happens within prison. There has been the sentencing guidelines change in 2025, so that pregnancy is a mitigating factor and pregnant women should not be sent to prison if it's avoidable. And similarly, under the Sentencing Act 2026, there's the new bail provisions in relation to pregnant women. So there have been changes, and I should probably just acknowledge there that those changes haven't come about by themselves. Like that's come
Mm.
about through absolute advocacy by very, very committed women with lived experience, such as my clients, and campaign organisations, particularly Level Up, who have spearheaded that campaign, and it's important to recognise that. I also just should mention my colleague Michaela Carini, because she's done a series of cases about sentencing appeals for pregnant women, and so I think all of that sort of storm of real life experience advocacy and then that culminating in legislative change is really important. So I think that's all progressive and good. Um, it's not fixed though, clearly,
No.
and we will need to see how some of the changes in the Sentencing Act are actually implemented, because there are some concerns that the new sort of standard recalls may create a further kind of churning door of people in and out prison and the impact that has on mothers, etc. So all of it is kind of to be seen, I think.
It's good that there has been some changes, but obviously there still needs to be more. And it's just all through hard work and people trying to support others. What do you think is the biggest change that you might have contributed to, or the thing that you're most proud of in your career?
Yeah, I mean that's quite a difficult question, I think, because I suppose like in my role as a human rights lawyer, when a client comes to see me, they're coming to see me because they've had the most horrible, traumatic experience. So I think
Mm.
it's quite difficult to say that I'm sort of proud of a particular piece of work for that reason, because it's sort of so connected to their trauma and their experience and pain. But I suppose what I would say, um, I think I can appropriately talk about is what's happening at the moment, because one of the urgent issues that I'm facing, and that again with a group of brilliant clients we're working on together, is the issue around handcuffing of pregnant women in labour and
Mm.
antenatal examinations and appointments. And that is a really urgent matter that requires urgent change. So I'm acting for 6 women who were handcuffed during labour and antenatal examinations, sometimes to male officers for different times. And through my approach, which is what we've talked about in terms of how to achieve accountability and change within a system that is sort of so weighted against my clients, how do you do that? And so the ways that we are doing it is that we have requested and have been fighting for an independent investigation to look at all of the incidences. What I have seen and what we're aware of through a deep dive review that the Secretary of State for Justice undertook following concerns raised by my clients is that there seems to have been multiple circumstances of women being handcuffed when they should not have been during examinations and labour.
I was just thinking about, particularly with women of colour, do you feel that women of colour obviously, particularly those that are pregnant, do you feel like in prisons they are treated harsher than white women by guards or other medical professionals?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's evidence to support that. You know, women of colour are disproportionately represented within the prison service. And I've worked on some quite horrible cases of racism within
Yeah.
prison, which have, in my view, I would say, have arisen from quite nasty stereotypes about, you know, kind of angry black women and disproportionate use of disciplinary action, etc.
Mm.
So all of that, I think, is really appalling. What I would add to that is, in my experience, women in prison are often quite reluctant to get a lawyer involved. And that's partly because they
Mm.
don't want to rock the boat, because they're fearful, for example, of consequences in relation to leaves or seeing their children and these types of issues. So I did a case which was reported in The Guardian in 2024 about a separation of a child from a black mother, where she had made multiple complaints about racism that she experienced. And that culminated in an apology and various other different kind of recognitions that she had asked for. And I think what that shows is, within the mother and baby unit process, which you may be familiar with. So within prison, there's units where you can live with your child usually up to 24 months. But what we found, and I think what that case really showed, was the use of kind of threats and punitive processes around, well, we'll take your child if you do X. And that was really shocking, given the racism that she was experiencing. Yeah.
Do you think, given the recent rise of the far right protests across Europe and the popularity of people like Tommy Robinson, do you think that racism has become more mainstreamed in our society today?
I mean, I think sadly it has, because
Yeah.
we're, I mean, um, some of the policies that Reform are pursuing are openly racist, I think.
Yeah.
And I think, after we're just seeing the whole sort of commentary and dialogue around immigration, um, it is quite overtly racist.
Yeah.
And yeah, there seems to be, a kind of acceptance that particular language and demonization of migrants is okay, and it will frequently go unchallenged in media in a way that I don't think it used to, but that's sort of my impression.
Yeah.
I don't know whether racism has increased or not, because, as a white person, I don't experience that. But I think, the climate appears hostile. Um, and that is really, really alarming, because it creates really significant uh, safety issues for people of
Yeah.
color, and that's really, really concerning.
Yeah. It's just horrific how it's almost become normalized.
Yeah, I mean, agreed. And it's sort of, it feels very retrograde. It feels like the kind of the abuse and threats that people experience. Um, that feels to me like something that should have been left behind, but it sadly
Yeah.
won't, because as we know, that those issues are continuing and growing.
What do you feel about how trans people are treated in prison and how they are perceived along with criminal activity, and just how this has sort of enhanced the transphobic movement that we're seeing in the UK at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a very sort of politically charged subject, clearly. Very, very strong views on either side. But I think what I would say, just as a sort of starting point, which is, as a feminist, I honestly find the focus of media and all of the commentary on trans people just to be a total distraction from the real issues that are impacting women.
Mm.
And I actually find it quite painful. I find it quite painful as a feminist that feminism has been co-opted in such a
Yeah.
way. For my part, the sort of issues impacting women are absolutely momentous. Um, there's a domestic violence, domestic homicide, as we've talked about, all of the issues in criminal justice. There's a crisis in maternity care, and particularly as we've seen for Black women and for women of color. Mental health services are at crisis point. There's like why there's sexual harassment. And I was reading there's an Ipso survey on which they did for Women's Day, so just you know last week or whenever it was.
Yeah.
And they were looking at attitudes on gender equality, and 1 in 2 men across 29 countries thought that men were discriminated against, and that women's, gender equality had kind of gone too far. And
Mm.
so I just think, like, why are we not talking about that? Like, why are we not talking about educating men? Why are we not talking about patriarchy and systems of power? Like, why are we not talking about that? And I just think all of that is just so much more important than for
Yeah.
women for women's rights. For women's rights, it's so much more important than where a trans person pees, to be honest. Like,
Yeah.
I find it utterly bizarre. Um, and yeah, I think we should probably sort of scrutinize why and how that discourse has arisen,
Yeah.
because it wasn't that way 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Mm.
And to my mind, I think the UK is a bit of an outlier when it comes to this, particularly the discussion and the environment around transgender rights. It's you know, it's as far as I am aware, in any event, it's not what you see in other countries other than the Trump administration.
Mm.
And yeah, so I think that's my sort of starting point, which I just think it's not a women's rights. It's not where women's rights should be. And as a feminist, I find it very depressing that all of this attention is taken from very, very real issues impacting women. So that's a sort of long-winded introduction, but I think in terms of prisons, I guess, well, I suppose it's, but again, we sort of just need to focus on the kind of reality of the situation, right? So the reality of the situation is that way before Fair Women Scotland, the prison service framework in England and Wales was that trans women will be allocated according to biological sex. Okay, so the consequence of that, in effect, is that the vast majority of trans women are held in male prisons. And there is a process, there's a process that is undertaken within prisons through what's called a transgender case board, and that is an individualized risk assessment about where it's appropriate for that trans woman to be, or indeed trans man to be allocated. And I think that's right, because it should be an
Yeah.
individualized risk assessment for various reasons, including violence to that person, but also any risk of violence that they pose to women. So it's plainly important that that happens. And from my experience, I have worked and acted for trans women who haven't gone through male puberty, who are sex workers, who are read as cis women, who have faced domestic violence from men and face the same sort of risk of sexual exploitation, substance misuse issues, poverty that other women face. And so
Mm.
I just think it's very important, and I really do think it's really important that we approach this issue with compassion, with a recognition that trans people are individuals, and that that we just have to be really careful to ensure that trans people are not used as political footballs, really,
Yeah.
and that there needs to be a bit of reflection about that, I would say.
Yes, I think the government tend to try to, well, certain parties in the government try to put transgender people as a scapegoat to other problems, and it's just ridiculous how that happens. And in terms of what you were talking about in the survey about 1 in 2 men feel discriminated against and feel like female equality has gone too far, I think that it's almost like because they've been continuously privileged and now they feel like that's at risk, they feel like that's being attacked.
Yeah, I mean, it's so
Horrible.
interesting, isn't it? And I just think if a lot of the kind of media and commentary was much more kind of around, men's attitudes and
Mm.
how to change that and how to actually address male violence, etc. Like,
Yeah.
I really do think that that would be quite an important shift. And I don't know how we do it, but I do think it's something that needs to happen. Yeah.
Yeah. Instead of just putting the focus on protecting women, to if we educated men from an early age, it would slow down the process of needing to have those extra interventions and protection in place. Like there was talks about having separate tubes for men and women because of the risk of women being harmed, but that wouldn't need to happen in the first place if men were educated from an early age.
I mean, yeah, I agree. And I think, there's sort of other, I mean, I think that's right. And I think there's sort of other kind of important sort of steps that could be taken, which, misogyny being a hate crime, for example. So just sort of really recognizing
Yeah.
that those pervasive and damaging attitudes about women, and really trying to challenge that is essential to actually addressing violence against women.
Yeah. I think it's also become more normalized in younger teenage boys with misogyny, with the rise of social media and people
Mm.
having too big of a platform to advocate their voices, all to do with the manosphere and toxic masculinity, and how young boys are just, they're vulnerable and they take that all information in and treat that as how you should normally treat women in society, and take that as, the base. It's just,
No, I mean, I agree. I think those are really valid points, and I think that's where the conversation should be. So it should be about, focusing on that education, and focusing on that, that uh, evidence, so that there can be real changes.
in terms of all the areas that you've worked in, um, mental health, pregnant women, what do you feel like? What is the biggest change you hope to make to the criminal justice system in the future of your career?
Well, I think it would be really, I mean, it's probably a cliche. I imagine that many people come on your podcast and say that the Corsten report recommendations should be implemented, but that's the 2007 report by Baroness Corsten, which, recommended the setting up of women's centres and the kind of presumption against imprisonment, because what we see is that imprisonment doesn't work. So I think as a goal, I would um, like there to be no need for a prison lawyer. As I would like there to be a real kind of significant change, so that um, there wasn't a need for the work that I do, and that would be,
Yeah,
I think, a really important and profound change. I mean, I see it in so many of my cases where women are just so sort of catastrophically let down. I had a case working with Cherie MacDonald, who is a wonderful client, whose mother, Christine MacDonald, died um, in HMP style again, uh, following her imprisonment for shoplifting. And she was imprisoned for stealing shampoo and bubble bath, some hair dye, and a piece of cheese. And that reactivated a community sentence order. And so she was sent to prison for the most low level offences, where she had a very, very tragic and significant event happen on the day that she was arrested, which is she witnessed her other daughter suffer catastrophic injuries. So she went into prison and didn't know whether her other daughter was alive or dead. And she was also opiate dependent. And so that is, as we've talked about, in my view, substance misuse should be treated as a disease and a public health condition. And she suffered a withdrawal in prison that was mismanaged. And ultimately, she ended up taking her own life in a death that the jury investigating her death found was contributed by neglect, because of the failures to provide her with basic medical attention for her opiate withdrawal, and because of failures by the prison service to respond, again, as we've talked about, but respond to her cries for help, respond to her cell bell and respond to her request to see a nurse. And I think, we've talked about why it's so important that women are listened to. And, tragically, this is another case that highlights that. But I think what it really shows in terms of those kind of what am I here for and what would I like to change is there's just no way that Christine should have been in prison. It's as simple as that. Like she
Yeah.
obviously should not have been in prison. And that is something that we all need to focus on and change, because you cannot keep sending traumatized women with particular mental health and drug dependencies, etc., to these institutions, because they are simply not safe, and it perpetuates the trauma. And I just don't. I mean, it's really depressing, but more women will die when they do not need to because of the system that we have. So I think the ultimate goal has to be making sure that there's no need for me and that there is no unnecessary imprisonment of women for non-violent offences. It's just completely bonkers. That would be my ultimate goal, really.
Yeah. You said about the current case that you're working with, about the 6 women and how they were handcuffed during examinations and even labour. What do you feel like the first step is into trying to change that?
Well, I feel like I'm on about step 17 because
Oh.
I've been working on that case. So the clients went, or 2 clients went public last February. So we wrote to the Secretary of State for Justice last January and said, we've got concerns about this. This is what their experience is. We think this is a wider problem. Can you check this? And told them what they need to do. And the Secretary of State for Justice did not provide a substantive response to that correspondence. And then 2 of my clients chose to speak to Channel 4 News and explain what had happened to them in a public forum, which is obviously an important way of shaming the state into doing something and requiring the first steps on what is going to be, I think, quite a long process to get those changes. But I mean, briefly, that for those 2 clients, so under their pseudonyms, Joanna was handcuffed for 34 hours during the induction of her labour, and Laura for 48 hours, including 12 hours during induction of labour, as well as on most, if not all, of their antenatal appointments. And they had, really appalling incidences where, they were chained to male officers and were going through very, very intimate examinations, and obviously the horrors and pain of labour whilst handcuffed is just immoral.
Yeah.
Under the prison service policy, the requirement was that handcuffs should be removed for pregnant women unless there are very exceptional circumstances when they arrived at hospital. And following the advocacy by my clients, they undertook, so when I say they, I mean the Secretary of State for Justice, undertook a internal review, which from the limited information that has been disclosed publicly about that, indicates that there were widespread issues with compliance with that policy across the prison estate. And so my clients have been fighting for a proper, independent, and effective examination and investigation into all of that to get to the bottom of what was going on. And they ultimately conceded to do that investigation. However, I have very serious concerns, as do my clients, in terms of the adequacy of what they have proposed, because at the moment they are, and again, to be clear, this is the Ministry of Justice. They have not said that my clients will be funded for legal representation. They have not said that they will notify all women who were impacted. They have not said that they will hold any aspect of the investigation in public, and they have not made any commitments in regard to disclosure and the rights of my clients to participate in the investigation. So the concern is that there is a lack of clarity and transparency about what's going on, and that rather than facilitating my clients to assist that investigation, my clients are being closed out of it. And so we are continuing to have a battle with them about this.
I mean, for your clients, the lack of clarity and just the lack of support from the Ministry of Justice must be just so frustrating and excruciatingly painful for them to just relive the whole situation continually and then not have that support that they need is just horrible.
I mean, absolutely. I mean, it's completely unacceptable. And from my client's perspective, their participation and involvement is because they do not want this to happen to anyone else.
Yeah.
And that is what they're there for. And they want some answers about how and why they were treated like that. And they are entitled to that, and it is as simple as that. So we will keep pushing to get that for them. They cannot be shut out of this, and we will make sure that they're not.
Do you feel like there's anything that the general public could do to help or support?
Yeah, I mean, there's always, as we've kind of touched on, but I think it's always important for human rights issues that there is, a kind of public campaign and help that can be afforded to try and highlight these issues and make changes. To be honest, I think it's actually quite rare for effective change to come through a legal process alone. Which other lawyers may not agree with, but because lawyers do like to emphasize their own importance. But I do you only really get change through a kind of culmination of advocacy and political work and lived experience and all of these groups and factors coming together to make a change. So yes,
Yeah.
absolutely. Keep an eye on the Bat Murphy website, and we will keep you all informed in terms of what's happening with that.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. You've been an incredible insight about what's going on in terms of those people that are more disadvantaged by the system and how you're supporting them and helping them, and the courage that they have at the moment to go through that. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's been really interesting talking to you. And thanks to the View magazine and everything that you're doing to really focus these really important issues and to bring it to everyone's attention. So I'm really grateful that you're doing this work.
Thank you. You've been listening to Rebel Justice. If you'd like to support our work and receive 4 digital editions and 1 print issue a year, subscribe to The View for just £20. Make sure to follow us on our social media, or on Instagram at theview_view_magazines. And you can also find us on LinkedIn, X and TikTok. If you'd like to reach out to us directly, you can email inquiries to us at press@theviewmagazine.org.